Miami's fan base is torn. Historically, they've always pursued the playoffs, but with a season that's likely to not go anywhere, should the Heat actually be tanking? We debate what tanking actually means and the pros and cons on today's episode of Locked On Heat.
You are Locked On Heat, your daily Miami Heat podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, welcome to Locked On Heat, your daily podcast on the Miami Heat, whether you're tuning in on YouTube or your favorite podcast app. Thanks for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day. I'm Wes Goldberg here with David Ramil. Both of us are credentialed Heat media members who cover this team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Have a great show for you today. We're starting to look ahead to the draft, and then we've got a big question to ask about tonight's game between the Heat and the Celtics. But first, David, we have a question from the Locked On Heat Insider community. Antonio writes in, when you get a chance, can you explain our draft pick scenario and how it works if we make or miss the playoffs and how the protections come into play? This is a good time to have this conversation, David. Obviously, the Heat losing 5 games in a row. They are where they are in the standings. And fans are wondering, even at our watch party, asking us, I think the most popular question I think I got at our watch party was, do you think the Heat should tank? So we might as well talk about it. They've lost 5 in a row. Here's at least the draft. Let's lay out the draft pick scenario before we get into the pros and cons. So incoming, the Heat are getting Golden State's top 10 protected pick. Right now that's slated to be around 20. So it looks like that's going to happen. Miami's going to at least have this 2025 pick coming from Golden State in the first round. That's worth just remembering. Here's the hard part. Outgoing. Miami owes a top 14 protected pick to the Thunder for this year. If they don't move that pick this year, it's unprotected in 2026. Also outgoing from the Terry Rozier trade, a top 14 protected pick in 2027. If that doesn't convey in 2027, it becomes unprotected in 2028. So here's the weird thing. Because these picks are so close together and because the protections kind of trigger the next year, if the Heat miss the playoffs this year, then they would keep their pick this year.
Right.
But then they would owe the pick in 2026 to the Thunder. And because of the step-in rule, which dictates that teams can't be without a first-round pick in consecutive seasons, once that pick is owed to Oklahoma City in 2026, that Charlotte pick that is protected in 2027 would automatically bump to unprotected in 2028 before we even get there. So that's the weird part. So when we're talking about making or missing the playoffs, keeping the pick this year, keeping the pick next year, you also have to consider what that means for 2027 and 2028. So there it is, David. That's how it all breaks out. Does that make sense?
It does. It does, at least as I understand it. And you know what? I'm glad you laid it out the way you did, because even as we were talking about it before we started recording, my thought process was, you know what, just get it done, let the picks go where they have to. But you know what? Now I'm kind of having a mind shift about it. To be honest with you, I think who knows what the draft is like? Who knows what this team is like in 28? Everything seems so up in the air. And I know maybe that's probably not the right approach to look at it from a general manager's perspective or even just a team building perspective. But if you had asked somebody 3 years ago if you thought the Miami Heat would be without Jimmy Butler, and whether or not they'd be looking into rebuilding, I think they would have laughed in your face. This was a very good team and Jimmy felt like he was going to be part of this group forever. And now that's completely different. So my feeling now is, you know what? See what you can do. Miss the playoffs. That's fine. If you miss the playoffs, you get the 2 picks in the first round this year. That's not a bad place to be, right? You can start retooling a little bit, seeing maybe you can make some off-season moves. At least it gives you a little bit more in the arsenal and the cupboard. It's not quite as bare as Pat Riley mentioned. And what happens in 2028, like we talked about the possibility of trading for Anthony Edwards, and one of the most frequent responses to that was, what are you guys even talking about? That's years from now.
Right.
And they're right. I mean, to a certain extent, a lot can change. He could make a request this offseason and it wouldn't be all that surprising, and they'd have to find a way to move him. Like, I don't think anybody expected them to move Karl Anthony Towns last year, and yet here they are. So, I mean, a lot can change, and that being the case, who knows what 2028 entails? Like, we're worried about it being an unprotected pick in 2028. Well, what if you do get Kevin Durant? What if you do get Anthony Edwards? What if you get somebody else in the meantime and a trade happens and you wind up being a damn good team and you wind up being a late first round pick? And so what if it's unprotected? It's not that pick that you necessarily are all that concerned about.
And you're like, why are we worried? I don't think any of us are worried.
Sure.
You know, there's a difference between how the fan base thinks about this and how the front office is going to think about it. The fan base is going to want the immediate gratification. Give us the pick now. We're so bad right now. Get us the pick now. And they see the names in this draft, and we'll get into some of the lottery odds and stuff like that. But like, what if we got a top 4 pick in this draft and got one of these guys and whatever? Like, and that's the fan base. You want everything right now. The front offices tend to take a longer view on this stuff, and that's part of it. I think the bigger part of this from the front office is they don't want to get embarrassed. They don't want to be embarrassed by having these unprotected picks in the future. Because at the end of the day, look, if you owe a pick or not, it doesn't really matter where the pick is. You don't have it. Right? If you owe a pick that's 15 or you owe a pick that's number 1 in the draft, fundamentally it doesn't matter how you construct your own roster. It's just the embarrassment of, oh my God, I can't believe we gave up the number 1 pick in the 28 draft for Terry Rozier 4 years ago. That's really fun. Okay. Like when you that's the only thing that the front office is the embarrassment of it.
Okay, I get that. I understand. Right? That puts the kind of kibosh on my whole argument there. Because
no, I don't think. No, if anything, I think it proves your argument. Like, why the fans shouldn't care about the embarrassment? What do I care about the embarrassment? It's the front office whose job is on the line. That if the next Victor Wembanyama is at the draft in 2028, and you gave up that pick for Terry Rozier 4 years ago, that could be a fireable offense if you're the general manager of a team.
Yeah, but you're right. But at the same time, it's kind of the hubris of the front office where they assumed, oh, we'll be okay. We'll be able to get Dame. Or, hey, it's all right. We'll be able to re-sign Jimmy. Or, hey, you know what? We'll still be a playoff team in 3 years. So it's not going to be that big a deal where that pick lands in 2028. And guess what? The prideful approach hasn't always worked. It has not been as successful a time, either transactionally or even in terms of being able to secure a title, as this franchise and front office would like. And so that being the case, you kind of have to think a little bit more cautiously. So I think it does kind of put the kibosh on the way I was thinking before, because now all of a sudden, if there's any chance, and who knows what might happen on the opposite end of the spectrum in 2028, you could be a really bad team by that point.
Mm-hmm.
And let's say 2028 is like 2003. Did anybody in 2000, when Alonzo Mourning was an MVP consideration and it was guiding this team to the playoffs, and you're acquiring Eddie Jones and you're acquiring, Anthony Mason, and who winds up being an all-star, and you're making all these moves to rebuild the team. Did you know that the flight to Sydney when he was participating in the year 2000 Olympics was going to be enough to exacerbate a potentially fatal kidney condition? Absolutely not. And for the next 2 years, that was an abysmal team, and they wound up being in the drafts at a top 5 position in 2003, and that turned out pretty good.
But some people think that this draft could be a lot like 2003, right? And so let's get into the pros and cons part of this, because the pros to keeping the pick this year are pretty cut and dry. I think the cons are a little bit more complicated, but the pros to keeping a pick this year: you add talent this season in a good draft. And there's a chance to move up in this lottery. I'll get to my worst case scenario here in a second, but the Heat are right now have the 11th best odds in the lottery. If everything was frozen right now, they would have the 11th best odds in the lottery. That's a 9.4% chance to get into the top 4. It's a 2% chance of getting the number 1 overall pick. Ain't nothing. But if they were to move into the 8th spot, which I think is doable, we just broke down what their next 10 games look like on yesterday's episode, and it's not pretty. Yeah. And
double digits,
you're only
below 500. Yeah.
You're only 2 losses away from Chicago in the loss column, and Chicago's at 8. If you were to hypothetically get to 8 as Miami, That's a 26.3% chance of getting a top 4 pick and a 6% chance of getting the number 1 pick. That's a big difference. 26% from 9% to getting a top 4 pick in a draft where everybody pretty much sees there's a clear top 4. Cooper Flagg, the Rutgers guys, VJ Edgecombe, like there's a clear top 4 in this draft. So you can get a, better than a 1 in 4 chance of moving into that top 4. Those are the pros of keeping the pick this year. You get to add instant addition of talent. And even, by the way, like we've seen what Miami has done from 10 to 14 in the draft, even if they just stay there. Bam Adebayo, Tyler Hero, these guys came from that 10 to 14 range. So we'll get into the cons of keeping this pick this year, and then talk a little bit more about what this game tonight against the Celtics means next here on Locked On Heat.
Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. March Madness is here, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to get in on the action like never before, because right now new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 extra to use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories and even who's cutting down the nets. It's so easy to get in on the action. The app is simple to use. When you win, you get paid instantly. No waiting around. And with tournament games happening almost every day, there's always something exciting to bet on. So go visit FanDuel.com and get in on the college hoops action all tournament long. We'll be right back.
Thanks for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day. Your favorite NBA team is a free daily newsletter. Introducing the Locked On Heat newsletter, one stop for ultimate Heat and league coverage with local analysis and amazing writing from Katie Heindel, Mike Shearer, and Locked On fantasy basketball tips from Josh Lloyd. Sign up for free now at LockedOnDaily.com. So before we get to the cons here, David, any other thoughts on the pros of keeping the pick this year?
No, not necessarily. It's what makes the draft so interesting for so many people. And yeah, the Heat have hit on a lot of good players, but it's also such a risky proposition. Like you need a grand slam. You need to hit one out of the park, and I don't know that that's necessarily going to happen with a top 10 pick. Like I mean, even if it's in the 9 to 10 range or 10th range, like that's likely to fall. Given how Miami's record is right now, like they're just not bad enough to fall into the top 8 or the worst 8 teams in the league. So you're basically arguing for a top 10 pick in the 9-10 range. I don't know. Can you get a superstar at that point? Like, yes, mathematically it's been done before, but I don't know how likely it is that star level player is available this year and that Miami would be able to acquire them. So I don't know. It's just
and one thing I do want to maybe put the kibosh on a little bit here is people are like, oh, well, you have the Warriors pick at like 20. You could package 10 and 20 and move up. I don't see that. It's a hefty price to move up in the lottery.
Moving up more than it rarely happens
in the 20s. Yeah, exactly.
Rarely happens.
But you're talking about giving up
both picks,
like unprotected picks later. What?
Could you use both picks to acquire a star though, or at least package it together with maybe
I'm glad you brought that
on
up.
The roster?
Yeah. So the fun, like the difference between the tradable picks, because we forgot to even mention that. There's essentially no difference. The 2025 pick you have from the Warriors can get traded regardless of whether or not you make or miss the playoffs. So that's not going to matter. Because you can always, if you have your pick this year or even next year, or I'm sorry, if you have your pick this year, you could still trade it, but you could trade it ahead of time, or you could make the selection for another team and then trade that way. And then if you owe the pick next year, you can do the same with the Warriors pick, make the pick for another team this year, and then still be able to trade next year's pick. But so that's part. Either way, you're essentially able to trade 3 first-round picks this summer. Because the other part of this too is 2032, that draft becomes unlocked this summer because it's always 7 years out.
2032.
So either way, the Heat are going to be able to trade 2029 and 2031 or 2030 and 2032, regardless of how those protections get moved around. So either way, the Heat are going to be able to trade basically 3 first-round picks of their own first-round picks this summer. In terms of the cons, if this pick is unprotected next year, next year's draft is also supposed to be really good at the top and not as deep as this year's draft. And I'm only like reading the draft experts, and I'm not claiming to know the big boards on these drafts, but like reading some of the draft experts on next year's draft. Next year's draft is supposed to be really good in the top 4. Carlos Boozer's kid, the Miami kid, he's at the top of this draft. There's 3 other guys that people like a lot, but it's supposed to be a really shallow, like European influx in this draft. Like there's not a lot of guys from Europe coming over, and it's sort of just the draft is pretty shallow next year. So if you were going to have like the 10th pick in a draft, it would be probably better to have it this year than next year, but everybody kind of agrees next year's top 4 is also really good, just like this year's top 4. And then you kind of run into, well, what if Carlos Boozer's kid's there? The Heat have some sort of disastrous season next year like the Pelicans are having this year, and you miss out a chance to get Carlos Boozer's kid. Like the potential embarrassment of that.
You're talking about like Cameron Boozer, and like the kid's still in high school, like he's a senior this year. And I don't even like, he plays for my alma mater. Like I know people who know him, and I mean, he's supposed to be like, he's a great player, really great kid, and the Boozer family has done a fantastic job of kind of preparing him for that next level. He seems to be as surefire as you're going to get. And he works for Coach Andrew Moran, who, as we know, has been Tyler Hero's offseason trainer and has worked with him, and he works with countless number of NBA players. So like they're getting, like, they've been a really successful tandem, the Boozer kids. They've been a really successful tandem over their years at Columbus High School. But it's just like, now we're talking about high school kids and like the 1 year that they'll spend at Duke. And are they going to be the franchise saviors in 2027? I don't know.
We're looking at, here's what it comes down to for me, and you're absolutely right, but like it comes down to me, or for me, it comes down to this. The Heat have been in the play-in tournament for 3 years in a row now. They'll probably be in the play-in tournament next year, unless they are able to go out and land a superstar this summer. So let's just assume that you're always going to be picking between, I don't know, 11 and 18 in the draft, like somewhere in that range, right? It's essentially sort of the same thing. Is it that, I guess the argument for trying to keep your pick this year and tanking, is it worth gambling on at best a 26% chance of getting a top 4 pick this year? That's what you're gambling is potential embarrassment down the line, and then kicking that 2028 pick as unprotected and all that kind of stuff. Is it worth gambling at best at a 26% chance of getting a top 4 pick this year?
Does this front office feel embarrassment though? Like that's a pretty. I don't know that they would. Like they've been in place for such a long time. I don't know that Mickey's not looking to fire his son. He's not looking to fire Pat Riley, who has salvaged this franchise back in 1995 and gave it an identity. Like this is different than other teams. Like they can afford to make mistakes. They can afford to write it out. And it's not that like they've been perfect, but I mean, they've been pretty good. Their success rate is fairly high. And I know it doesn't feel that way for fan bases that have been kind of stolen and spoiled a little bit. And look, you can argue it and you have valid points in terms of this team has only achieved success because of Dwayne Wade and then LeBron James and then Jimmy Butler. Absolutely. Like those players were critical in doing so, but it doesn't matter. Like this is a very chicken and egg conversation, and it doesn't matter. Pat Riley had the vision and the stability in place, and it's led to some really great structure here in terms of being able to create something for Dwayne to succeed in 2006, and then eventually for that to set the kind of tone for LeBron's coming in 2010 and leading to 2 more titles. You can't really argue.
And to that embarrassment point too, it's a great point. This team is almost insulated from the politics that rule other organizations in the NBA. And so if they do make a mistake, and if in 2028 they have the number 1 pick, they owe the number 1 pick, and then the next Victor Wembanyama's in that draft, and fans are wondering, why don't we have the pick in this draft? Oh, it's because we traded for Terry Rozier 4 years ago.
Yeah.
Every other general manager would get fired because of
Oh.
that. But Andy Ellisberg won't, right? So I guess what it really comes down to then is how do the Heat feel about this draft and next year's draft? Would they rather have a pick at, let's call it 10 this year, or a pick at 10 next year? Right? And maybe that's all it comes down to. And then the added thing here where they also have the 20-something pick from Golden State. Do they say, well, we already have one pick in this draft, so let's spread this out? Or do we really like this draft and we like the top 10 in this draft, so we prefer this one? I also heard that Golden State was more than willing to part with that 2025 pick because they didn't love basically 10 through 30 in this draft.
Second half of the draft, yeah.
But that's Golden State. I don't know how Miami evaluates this draft. So I don't know. It's maybe that's as simple as it is. And at the end of the day, I don't know that it matters what they think, because I don't think that this team is purposely tanking. And so they might just end up with the 8th best odds in the lottery anyway, and then we just go from there. I think the worst case scenario would be to end up at like 13 or 14 and then have these picks get kicked to unprotected in 2027 and 20. It's like for what? For the 14th pick in this draft, that would kind of be the worst case. You want to do a tankathon spin before we get out of here?
Yeah, that's good. You know what? If you're pulling that up right now, I just there is no tank in place. Not right now, or it hasn't been in place. Look, head scratching decisions from Eric Spoelstra notwithstanding, really bad level of play, all that absolutely true. 5-game losing streak. I got it. This team isn't throwing games. They're not good enough. They're missing a lot. And we've talked about it from different perspectives and different angles. They're not actively tanking in that regard. They're not. This is not how this franchise has historically operated. I don't think that's the case this year either. So, for a lot of people who believe that the tank is on, it's not. The sad reality is they're just bad. Or else they would have tanked a lot of games sooner.
I have news for you.
What's that? We got the first pick?
I spun it. Miami got the first pick. Tank. Cooper Flag. Let's go. Heat Celtics tonight. Talk about it next.
Today's episode is brought to you by Monarch Madness. You ever check your bank account? Where did all my money go? Between dining out or getting some stuff online or entertainment, it's easy to lose track. And that's where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app, it's a complete financial command center. You can track all of your accounts, investments, and spending in one place. So you stop just managing your money and start building wealth. When I started using Monarch, I realized just how much I was spending on food delivery. Now you budget smarter and you save more. It's so easy to manage all your money with your partner. It's smoother than ever. You can track, share in a personal account, set goals, and stay on the same page without the stress. So take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com. Code LOCKEDONNBA for half off your first year. We'll be right back.
Thanks for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day. The best way to support the show, like and subscribe on YouTube. Follow us on your favorite podcast app. The Heat faces Celtics tonight. David, you and I were talking about this before we started recording here. You raised a really interesting question.
Yeah, it does not have the allure of the matchup that it once did. And my question was, is this even a rivalry anymore? And it feels like between the departure of Jimmy Butler and the fact that the Celtics won a championship last year, despite all the bad blood, despite everything else, I don't know that it's still a rivalry. It feels like Boston has so far eclipsed what Miami is now becoming that it's pointless. It's like saying, that you have a rivalry against a mountain. You can throw pebbles at it as much as you want. The mountain doesn't care. And that's basically what Miami's doing. I don't know what the outcome of Friday's game is against Boston. And it saddens me to say it because, look, I took a great deal in personal and professional joy over the last few years of being able to tell Boston fans, hey, guess what? You're still pretty scared of Jimmy Butler, because they were scared of Jimmy Butler. They were scared of this Heat team. They might not want to admit it because now that clearly they're at a different echelon than Miami is. But in terms of whether or not you look at this matchup on Friday, this should have been a fun marquee matchup. This should have been an extension of the rivalry and all the bad blood that goes back years. Even Kevin Garnett versus Dwayne Wade and continuing on through the the big three era and continuing on through the Jimmy Butler stint here in Miami. This should have been a rivalry. And yet, without the players, without Jimmy specifically here on this roster, I don't know that you can look at it as a rivalry anymore. And that's it's not great, but I think that's also the reality of where this team is. Like Bam being as close as he is to Jason Tatum, and Boston being as good as they are in terms of the league and having won a championship and being a title contender this season. And here we are talking about Miami tanking, and maybe they might get lucky and get a good pick, but they're clearly not good enough to make any noise in the playoffs. Like, what's the point? What's the point of looking at this game on Friday and believing that there's enough of a rivalry there? Not there's going to be some animosity between fans, because Boston fans are by and large loud and obnoxious, and for that I won't apologize. But that's their problem, not mine. But Miami fans should not look at this and hope for anything in terms of getting any kind of joy out of this matchup or looking forward to it in particular, because I don't think the Celtics care. Like, you and I were even talking about this before we started recording, and they're listing top players on this roster, Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, as questionable. This is where Miami is. They're the team you can rest your stars against, and you still have a pretty good chance of winning. I don't know that Sam Hauser and Peyton Pritchard aren't going to be the guys that beat the Miami Heat on Friday. That's where Miami is right now, because they seem like they've forgotten how to win. Do you think of it as a rivalry?
No. This is, at this point, Don Draper looking at that kid in the elevator and saying, I don't even think
I don't think about you at all. Yeah.
And you mentioned the history there between the Heat and the Celtics, and you brought up the big three and all that stuff. The big three kind of ended the Celtics era of Garnett, Pierce, Ray Allen, that whole thing. And it feels like history repeated itself, but in the opposite way, where the Celtics vanquished the Celtics vanquished the Heat era, the Jimmy Butler era, right? And that Celtics era went out with a whimper, and this Heat era went out with a whimper. Like, that Jimmy Butler era, unfortunately, went out with a whimper, right? Jimmy Butler was injured in the first round series against them last year, and then obviously everything that happened this regular season. So maybe this is just what it was always supposed to be. But you think back to the bubble where Bam is blocking Jason Tatum at the rim, and those amazing series that the teams had 2 years later in 2022, and that amazing series that they had in 2023, and just some all-time playoff moments for both of these franchises, right? Like, you even go to the Celtics, like Derek White with the tip in, and all just incredible moments for both of these franchises and these organizations. But the Celtics found a way to build on it, and the Heat were only always trying to cling on to it until they lost their grip. And that happened this year. And it's unfortunate, it's depressing, and I can use any other amount of adjectives, and it just sucks. But that's where we are. It's not a rivalry anymore. Not even close. And that's the unfortunate part about this. But what's weird about it is that was always Jimmy Butler led, like that era. But Bam and Tatum are the same age. They've won Olympic gold medals together this last summer. Like, there's no reason why. Now, like, Tatum was a top pick.
Who does Bam hate?
Brown was a top pick.
Who does Bam hate? Like, I hate to interrupt, and I apologize, but it's like, who? Like, Jimmy.
I don't even care.
Jimmy was fueled by this wonderful. Well, Jimmy was fueled by this wonderful hatred that just like carried us alongside with him. You know, it's like Jimmy going nose to nose with Grant Williams, just the way he carried himself, and then like Bam just doesn't have that. Like, I want him to like actively dislike these players that you could see it.
Jaylen Brown, the only thing Jaylen Brown hates is Nike.
And Duncan Robinson's shoulder.
It's Duncan Robinson kind of has that little snot factor a little bit. Yeah. But he no, but like look at what Boston did. They built around Tatum and Brown. And that's the thing that the Heat's front office kept getting criticized for, is like, you didn't go out and get Derek White. Like, Rohan Nadkarni likes to come on the show and talk about this, points it out every single time. Derek White was out there. You could have gotten Derek White. You didn't go get Derek White. You didn't go get Drew Holiday. You didn't go get Kristaps Porzingis. You were spinning your wheels on Kevin Durant and Damian Lillard and Donovan Mitchell and these guys. And
fair enough.
I think that's a big reason why maybe this isn't a rivalry now either, because maybe you do those things and you say, you know what, we're good enough. Let's just pay Jimmy Butler the money, even though it's not going to look good 2 or 3 years from now. Like, this window is still open. I don't know.
Are Bam and Tyler on the equivalent level of Tatum and Brown?
No.
Clearly not. So, I mean, that's where kind of
I mean,
it
Bam.
starts like,
I would put Bam at the same level as Jaylen Brown.
okay.
Hero
Second
is
tier star.
somewhere in between, the Celtics guys and the rest of the Celtics top 2 and the rest of them. Or, Hero's probably at the same level as like a Derek White, right? They're very different skill sets, but, probably both top 50-ish players in the NBA.
Okay.
And then they're just missing that number 1. And that was Jimmy Butler became that guy who could go toe-to-toe with Tatum in the playoffs, but he just never was that guy in the regular season. But, I don't know. I don't know. Like Tatum is clearly at his prime, and Jimmy Butler no longer is at his prime. So maybe this always had an end date, regardless of whether or not you would have surrounded him with more talent.
Yeah, I agree.
But that's the life cycle of the NBA, right? That's how it works. We'll see what happens tonight. Like you already said, Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, they're questionable for tonight's game. So maybe the Heat could steal a win. They have not beaten the Celtics in a regular season game since January 24th, 2023.
It's due. They're due, right?
They're
And
due.
in many, many ways.
They're due.
In
You're
many
due.
ways, yeah. Yeah.
Thanks for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day. Like, comment, subscribe on YouTube. Follow us on your favorite podcast app.